At 03:12 hours on the morning of November 14th, 1943, a cipher clerk named Corporal Harold Fenwick sat in a low-ceilinged communications room in Algiers and noticed something wrong with the transmission routing code. He was 22 years old. He had been in North Africa for 11 months. He had seen men crack under artillery fire, under the desert heat, under the weight of things they'd been ordered to forget. He had never, until that moment, suspected that the wrong thing was sitting 2 offices down the hall, wearing a British major's uniform, drinking from a tin mug, and waiting for dawn. The man's name was Major Edmund Carver, 41 years old, 14 years of military intelligence, decorated at Dunkirk, trusted at the highest levels of Allied covert planning in the Mediterranean theater. His personnel file ran to 63 pages. His vetting record was clean. Every single page of it was a careful construction. What Fenwick had noticed, a routing anomaly in a 4-digit authentication sequence, would unravel 3 years of deception, expose a network of 12 compromised operatives, and collapse an operation that had cost the Allies 6 months of planning and at least 4 lives in the field. By 900 hours that morning, a man everyone trusted would be in handcuffs. By noon, the shock would reach London. This is the story of how Edmund Carver became the most damaging double agent the Allies uncovered in the entire North African campaign, and how a 22-year-old corporal with tired eyes and a cup of cold tea brought the whole thing down. To understand what Carver was, you have to understand what he appeared to be. He had entered military intelligence in 1929, recruited directly out of Cambridge by a senior Foreign Office examiner who reportedly described him in a private memo as precisely the kind of cold, orderly mind this work requires. Carver was methodical. He had a gift for organizational logic, the kind of thinking that untangles operational timelines, coordinates compartmentalized information flows, spots the gap between what 2 departments each believe the other knows. He was not glamorous. He was not a field man. He was the person who made field operations possible by ensuring the structures supporting them held shape under pressure. That made him extraordinarily dangerous as an adversary. He was recruited by German military intelligence, the Abwehr, in late 1940, almost certainly during a posting to neutral Lisbon where the boundaries between Allied and Axis intelligence communities were famously porous. The exact circumstances of his turning have never been fully established. What is known is that by early 1941, Carver was providing the Abwehr with low-level material, administrative schedules, courier route rotations, nothing operational enough to raise alarm. He was establishing his value slowly, carefully, the way a patient man builds anything meant to last. By 1942, the material he was passing had become significantly more substantial. By the time he arrived in Algiers in June 1943 and assigned to the planning cell for Operation STARFALL, a coordinated Allied effort to insert resistance networks into southern Italy ahead of the anticipated invasion, Edmund Carver had become one of the Abwehr's most productive assets in the Western theater. He knew the names of agents. He knew insertion timetables. He knew the radio frequencies and authentication protocols used by 3 separate field teams. He also knew how to behave like a man who knew none of those things. Operation Starfall had been conceived in the spring of 1943, in the aftermath of the successful Torch landings and the grinding Tunisian campaign that followed. The logic was straightforward. If the Allies were going to move into Italy, and by mid-1943 the strategic calculus pointed firmly in that direction, they needed networks already in place. Sympathetic contacts, safe houses, people who could identify German unit movements, who could guide supply drops, who could receive and shelter the agents that would follow the initial landings. Building those networks took months. It took careful selection of local contacts, meticulous legend construction for the inserted agents, and a secure communications infrastructure that could sustain a flow of intelligence without alerting German counterintelligence. It took exactly the kind of organizational architecture that Edmund Carver had spent his entire career learning to build. He had been assigned to Starfall's administrative backbone, the planning cell that coordinated the logistical and communications elements of each insertion. He did not decide who went in or where. He did coordinate the signals protocols. He did process the authentication tables. He did move paper between departments in ways that gave him access to the full operational picture in pieces, which he was capable of assembling in his head with the same quiet precision he applied to everything else. By November 1943, 4 Starfall agents were already inside Italy. A 5th insertion was 22 days out. 2 of the 4 active agents had gone silent in ways that their handlers had chalked up to compromise local infrastructure. The Italian contacts had been unreliable, the communications difficult, the margin for error narrow. Nobody had considered that the error might be in Algiers. Corporal Harold Fenwick was not, by his own later account, looking for anything in particular that night. He was a signals technician, yet assigned to the graveyard shift because the more senior operators had maneuvered themselves off it. His job was to monitor incoming traffic, log authentication confirmations, and flag anything that didn't resolve cleanly against the current cipher tables. It was repetitive work, demanding in a narrow technical sense, easy to do poorly through inattention. Fenwick did it well, mostly because he was the kind of person who found the patterns in things whether he intended to or not. At 0312, a routine administrative transmission from the Starfall cell came through carrying an authentication suffix, standard procedure. The suffix was a 4-digit sequence that rotated on a schedule known only to authorized personnel within the planning cell. Fenwick cross-checked it against that evening's cipher table. It was correct, and he logged it and moved on. Then, approximately 8 minutes later, he processed a second transmission, a different administrative routing from a different internal office, carrying a different authentication suffix from a different rotation table. Also correct. Nothing unusual. Except that when Fenwick glanced back at his log sheet, he noticed that the first authentication suffix, the one from the Starfall cell, was not the code assigned to that date on the rotation. It was tomorrow's code. He sat with that for a moment. The mug of tea in his hand had gone cold without him noticing. Tomorrow's code. Used tonight. A code that the current day's rotation did not contain, meaning whoever had used it either had access to the next 24 hours of authentication tables or had made an error so specific that it pointed to only one explanation. Someone inside the Starfall planning cell had the complete rotation table. Not just today's sequence, all of them. That was not authorized. The rotation table was issued 1 day at a time to prevent exactly this kind of exposure. Whoever had sent this transmission had used a code they should not have possessed. Fenwick flagged it. He flagged it calmly, with the language of someone who was not certain, who was offering an observation for review rather than an accusation. He was 22 and not a fool. By 0430, his supervisor had confirmed the discrepancy. By 0600, the chain of escalation had reached the duty security officer. By 0715, a quiet, controlled audit of Starfall's communications logs had been authorized. Not announced, not explained to the cell, simply initiated by 2 counterintelligence officers working from a separate terminal with access to the full archive. What they found took less than 90 minutes to become impossible to explain away. The transmission Fenwick had flagged was not an isolated incident. Over the preceding 4 months, the counterintelligence officers identified 9 administrative communications originating from or routed through the Starfall planning cell that contained authentication data from future rotation windows. The sequences were subtle. They would not have been visible to anyone who was not, as Fenwick had been, simultaneously processing multiple authentication streams and comparing them to that evening's specific table. The person who had embedded this material had understood exactly how difficult it would be to spot. They had also, and in doing so, made a single mistake. On 3 separate occasions, the future-dated authentication codes appeared in transmissions that had been personally initiated by Major Edmund Carver, not routed through him, not processed by his office. initiated by him bearing his authorization signature in the header block. The duty security officer, a captain named David Moresby, who had been in counterintelligence since 1940, later described his reaction with characteristic British economy. "I was not surprised," he said. "I was tired. There's a difference." He ordered a discreet physical surveillance of Carver's office and quarters while the paper audit continued. He did not brief anyone outside the counterintelligence chain. He did not tell the Starfall cell that anything was happening. He did not. And this decision was later reviewed carefully and judged correct. Pull Carver immediately. Because pulling Carver immediately would have told the Abwehr that they had a problem. And Moresby needed to know how deep the problem ran before anyone outside Algiers learned it existed. The next 7 hours were the longest in Moresby's career. He said so himself years afterward in a declassified internal memoir that was not publicly available until 1987. The physical surveillance produced nothing immediately actionable. Carver arrived at his office at his normal time, 8:30. He took his normal tea. He sat at his desk and worked through a stack of administrative correspondence with the methodical focus that had characterized his service for 14 years. He gave no indication that he knew anything was wrong. He either didn't know or he was extraordinary. Moresby believed the latter. The paper audit, meanwhile, had moved beyond the authentication discrepancies into a broader review of Carver's communications output over the preceding 5 months. What emerged was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was precise. Carver had spent 5 months embedding operational data, insertion dates, agent cover identities, signal schedules, into the administrative traffic of the planning cell in ways that were individually meaningless and collectively catastrophic. Each piece, taken alone, was the kind of routine administrative information that passed through a planning cell by the dozens every day. Combined, assembled by someone who knew what they were looking at, they formed a complete picture of Starfall's operational architecture. Yet 2 agents had already gone silent. The Germans had not needed to make a move that looked like German intelligence had a source. They had simply known where to look. And Italian counterintelligence had done the rest. By 10:45, Moresby had enough. He placed 2 men outside Carver's office door, 1 man outside the building entrance, and 1 outside the private quarters. He walked into the office himself, closed the door behind him, and set a single piece of paper on the desk in front of the major. It was a printout of 3 transmission headers. Carver's name in the authorization block. Future-dated authentication codes. Carver looked at the paper for a long moment. He did not reach for it. He did not look up immediately. When he did finally meet Moresby's eyes, and his expression was the same one he wore when reviewing an administrative discrepancy in an agent's travel documentation. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since about 4 this morning," Moresby replied. Carver nodded once. He put down his pen, placed his hands flat on the desk, and said nothing further until his legal representative arrived 2 hours later. The arrest itself took 11 minutes and produced no incident. Carver was cooperative in the manner of a man who had already made every decision he intended to make. He answered no questions in the immediate term. He made no dramatic statements. He asked twice, in the following days of initial detention, whether the operational teams in the field had been recalled, and was told both times that this was not information he was entitled to. His demeanor throughout the process was described by every officer who interacted with him in those early days using variations of the same word: calm. What the arrest triggered, however, was anything but. The Starfall cell was stood down within 4 hours of Carver's detention. The 2 active agents whose communications had gone dark were declared compromised and extraction procedures were initiated. 1 succeeded, 1 did not. The 5th insertion, 22 days out, was canceled. The Italian resistance contacts whose identities Carver had had access to were considered burned and their networks instructed to go to ground. In London, the news reached the section chief by secure cable at approximately 1400 hours. The cable was 12 lines long. It contained no editorial language. The section chief reportedly read it twice. He set it down and instructed his assistant that his afternoon appointments should be canceled. The broader damage assessment took 6 weeks and involved counterintelligence personnel from 3 allied agencies. Its conclusions were classified at the highest available level and remained so for decades. What is known from later declassifications is this: Carver had compromised at least 12 individuals working in or adjacent to Starfall over the course of his tenure. Of those 12, 4 were confirmed dead by war's end in circumstances consistent with capture and execution. 2 were captured and survived. The remaining 6 carried the uncertainty of that period for the rest of their lives, never knowing precisely what Carver had passed or what had found its way back to them through channels they could not see. Yet the investigation into how Carver had been turned and how he had survived his initial vetting consumed a significant portion of Allied counterintelligence resources in the first half of 1944. The Lisbon hypothesis that he had been recruited during his 1940 posting was eventually accepted as most probable. The specific mechanism was never established with certainty. What the investigators concluded was that Carver had been an exceptionally disciplined asset who had operated for years below the threshold at which any single anomaly would have generated review. His tradecraft was precise because he had been, for over a decade before his recruitment, the person who designed the protocols that tradecraft had to avoid. He knew where the tripwires were because he had installed them. His interrogation had conducted over a period of several months by teams with significantly more leverage than a quiet office in Algiers, produced partial information. He confirmed elements of his contact history. He identified 2 Abwehr handlers, both of whom had already been identified through other means. He provided a partial account of the material he had passed, which aligned imperfectly with the independent damage assessment, suggesting, as these things often do, that the full picture was larger than either party was willing to place on record. He did not express remorse in any form that his interrogators found credible. He was tried by military tribunal in 1944. The proceedings were conducted in camera. The verdict was guilty on all substantive charges. The sentence was commuted from execution to life imprisonment, a decision that generated controversy at the time and has been discussed by intelligence historians ever since, with theories ranging from a quiet arrangement involving further cooperation to political considerations at the senior Allied level that preferred the matter remain contained. Carver served 12 years. He was released in 1956 under terms that were not publicly disclosed. He lived in England under a different name, in a rural county, until his death in 1971. He gave no interviews. He published nothing. His neighbors, by all accounts, found him unremarkable. Harold Fenwick left military service in 1946 and returned to Lancashire, where he worked for the remainder of his career as a telecommunications engineer for the General Post Office. He did not discuss his wartime service in any detailed way until a historian conducting research in the late 1970s located him through the declassified signals logs and requested an interview. He agreed with characteristic lack of ceremony. He described the night of November 14, 1943, in a manner that is notable for what it does not contain. No heroism, no drama, no sense that he had understood, at the moment of discovery, the full weight of what he was looking at. "I noticed it because it was wrong," he said. "That's all it was. The numbers didn't match the sheet. You flag what doesn't match the sheet. That's the job." He was asked whether he had ever thought about the agents in the field, the people whose survival or capture had hinged in some part on the note he had flagged at 3 a.m. in a room in Algiers. Now he was quiet for a moment. "I thought about them," he said. "I still think about them." He did not elaborate. The historian wisely did not press. The Starfall case became a foundational study in Allied counterintelligence training in the post-war period. though it was referred to for many years under a different operational designation to protect sources and methods that remained active. Its primary teaching value was not the detection. The cipher anomaly that Fenwick spotted was, in operational terms, a lucky accident, the kind of break that doctrine cannot reliably produce. The case was taught for what it revealed about systemic vulnerability. Carver had survived because the vetting system was designed to catch people who were hostile at the point of entry, said it was not designed to catch a loyal officer who became hostile later. The counterintelligence structures of the period assumed that a clean file meant a clean man. The STARFALL review produced, among its recommendations, the framework for what would become ongoing behavioral monitoring protocols, periodic reevaluation of access privileges, anomaly tracking and communications patterns, the structured assumption that history was not a guarantee. Those recommendations were implemented across Allied intelligence structures in modified form by late 1944. Their descendants are present in every modern security clearance system in the Western world. The rotation table protocol, the one that produced the discrepancy Fenwick flagged, was redesigned within months of the Carver arrest to make one-day issuance the only option at every level of the system. A technical patch, a small one, the kind of adjustment that takes a paragraph to describe and a morning to implement. It cost 4 people their lives to learn it was necessary. There is a document in the British National Archives, declassified in 1998, catalogued under a reference number that most researchers walk past without stopping, that contains a single paragraph relevant to this story. It is the personal diary of Captain David Moresby, donated by his family a decade after his death in 1989. The entry is dated November 14, 1943. It is not long. Fenwick's flag checked out. Carver under watch. If we're right, Starfall is finished and several good people are in worse trouble than they know. If we're wrong, I've made the worst professional error of my life. I am fairly confident we are not wrong. The precise codes do not end up in the wrong transmission by mistake. They end up there because someone put them there. The question I keep returning to is not how he did it. That part is almost clear. The question is how long he did it before tonight. He underlined that last sentence. The answer, when it came, was approximately 3 years. That is what a single procedural gap costs. Measured in time. Measured in people, the number is harder to state cleanly. Harder to hold still long enough to look at directly. The counterintelligence files from this period are careful and thorough, and they do not say, in any document that has been declassified, whether every person whose identity passed through Edmund Carver's hands is accounted for. Some of them almost certainly are not. That, too, is part of the record. The part that doesn't fit in a single paragraph, or a verdict, or a commuted sentence. Fenwick noticed the wrong numbers on a sheet. He flagged them. He went home at the end of his shift and ate breakfast and presumably slept. The way a man sleeps who has done his job correctly and has no way of knowing yet how large that job turned out to be. The rest of it happened the way these things happen. Slowly, then all at once. And then in the long silence afterward, in the files that took decades to open, in the questions that never got clean answers. Edmund Carver died in a rural English county in 1971. The record does not indicate whether anyone attended his burial. If this story stayed with you the way it stays with us, hit that like button and subscribe. We cover the cases, the operations, and the people that history filed quietly and then forgot to retrieve. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.